Oh boy, I'm about to explain something that for some reason I found incredibly difficult to find information about. When I first started out and I was using an APSC camera and I was trying to figure out the whole crop factor thing, and I was asking all these questions about, like if it's 35 millimeters, but if it's a 52 millimeter equivalent, and they make it for an APS-C camera, why don't they just call it a 52 millimeter? And I would get these answers from people like, well, 35 millimeter is a 35 millimeter. Like really condescending, kind of holier than thou answers from people all the time. And nobody ever really broke down the differences or the nuances about it, where actually equivalent and crop factor should never even be used in the same sentence, actually, because if you're really into the lens focal length journey, which is a kind of a spiritual journey, if you want your filmmaking to be nuanced, to be specific and meticulous, and if you really want to have a style of your own, if you want to develop something that people look at and go, that's that person's work, like if you really want to paint a picture, and create something unique that you're in control of, that exactly the way you want it to look and feel, then you have to understand the way this crop factor thing works for Micro Four Thirds, APS-C, and full frame. And so I guess the best way to describe it would be that, a 35 millimeter is like, I guess it kind of looks like a 52 millimeter in terms of distance, how far away you are from the camera and what's showing, although not really, because the point, the truth is that a 35 millimeter is simply a 35 millimeter. Like the glass in the lens is made 35 millimeter for a 35 millimeter focal length, meaning the compression, the distortion, the way it looks, is going to be a 35 millimeter. And I know that it's like incredibly confusing, right? Best example I could make is this. Let's say you're shooting a headshot like this. Now, right now I'm using a 35 millimeter on a Micro Four Thirds. I'm using the Panasonic GH5, and I'm shooting with a 35 millimeter f1.4. So that's a 70 millimeter equivalent, supposedly, right? I mean, that's what people are going to tell you. Shoot as if it's 70 millimeters. Somebody's calling me on this phone as I'm talking to you. Of course, I'm not going to answer it. But, shoot as if it's 70 millimeters, right? Hold on, let me just decline. So anyway, here's the thing. A 70 millimeter lens on a full frame camera, which means it is simply 70 millimeters. It is what it says it is, right? The only time you get to have that opportunity is if you're using a full frame camera. 70 millimeters is 70, 50 millimeters is 50, 85 is 85, 18 is 18, period. There's no math, there's no crop factor, there's nothing. And so you know what it looks like, right? But you also know what it feels like in terms of compression, how far away the background is, like the way it kind of changes the way you look. Because if you look at yourself on a 35 millimeter, like what I'm doing right now on this camera, and I'm not going to show you, I'm just going to tell you because I don't have multiple cameras to do this right now. But even though this is a 70 millimeter equivalent, I will never look like a person looks through a 70 millimeter lens on a full frame camera. I don't care how you match it, how you move back and, get the distance right and frame it properly and all that kind of stuff. You're never going to get the same compression or the same feeling that you get from a 70 millimeter true kind of, portrait lens, where you look a little bit fuller. It looks more like what you look like in real life. Like on a 35 millimeter, I look thinner or smaller than I actually am in real life. And, people say 35 millimeters is the closest to real life, but other people say a 50 millimeter is the closest to real life. And, whatever, that's a matter of opinion, and that's going to be different for everybody. However, 35, if you use a 35 millimeter on a full frame camera, I don't care what you do. If you use a 35 millimeter on an APS-C camera, you're going to look the same. Just move back and forth and see that if you used a 70 millimeter on the APS-C camera, you're going to look completely different. I'm confusing myself. What I'm saying is that right now I'm using a 70 millimeter equivalent, right? But I don't look like you would look. I don't look like I would look through a 70 millimeter lens at all. I would look completely different. My face would be fuller, the background would be closer to me, it would appear to be closer to me, it would have a completely different look, even if you move back and forth and change the frame. I look like a 35 millimeter look. That's what it looks like. So you have to understand, when you're using, say, a micro four thirds camera, you have to kind of think in those terms. Like, even though you're using a 35 millimeter lens and it's a 70 millimeter equivalent, if you want the nuanced look of a 70 millimeter, you're going to have to get a 70 millimeter lens, which is a 140 millimeter equivalent, but you're going to have to move way back. And see, that's the disadvantage of micro four thirds. Like, you can do relatively the same thing, but you can't do exactly the same thing. And that's what people are talking about when they're talking about a full frame look, or a micro four thirds look, or an APS-C or Super 35 look. You know, you do have to move to get the approximate look of the equivalent lens focal length, but you are not going to get the same look. You're not going to get the same feeling. Nuance is everything. So in my opinion, you know, micro four thirds, APS-C, full frame, it doesn't matter what you use as long as you understand how you have to use it and get used to that. And also understand that, you know, like, if you're using a micro four thirds camera and you want a 50 millimeter look inside of a car, for example, or a small space, it's going to be really difficult to get that look. Like, you'll be able to get that kind of thing if you get like a 9 or a 12 or a 17 millimeter lens, and you get way back and you can get a 34 millimeter equivalent, or if you get a 25 and you get a 50 millimeter equivalent. But let's say you get that 25 millimeter, which is a 50 millimeter equivalent, and you move as far back in the car as you want, and you frame the person and you get the shot. It ain't going to look like a 50 millimeter look. It's not going to look the same. Now, by the same token, if you're using a full frame camera and you got a 50 millimeter lens, you're going to get that look. And you're going to be in the exact same distance away that you would have to be with a micro four thirds and a 25 millimeter. Am I confusing you? See, the thing is, you have to know how to use the camera that you're using, and there are going to be certain limitations, and you're going to have to buy lenses that are appropriate to the look that you want. You know, if you're looking for a 50 millimeter look, you got to get 50 millimeter lenses no matter what you have. If you want a 75 millimeter look, you're going to have to get a 75 millimeter lens no matter what you have. But then you're just going to have to adjust how far away you are from the subject. But you can't do that equivalent thing and get that kind of nuanced look. You can't get that kind of compression just from moving the same amount of distance away. It's just not going to look the same, because 35 is 35, 50 is 50, 18 is 18, 16 is 16, like a 16 millimeter f1.4 Sigma lens on an APS-C camera is 32 millimeter equivalent. It's a 24 millimeter equivalent on APS-C. And so people say, well, it's like having a 24 millimeter lens, but it's not, because it doesn't look the same. It does not look the same. It might look roughly the same, but if you take a 24 millimeter full frame shot and compare it to a 16 millimeter, which is a 24 equivalent on an APS-C camera, they'll be roughly the same, but there is nuance. There are levels to this. You know what I mean? Like, if you really want to get into the weeds and be really specific and really, really understand what compression and what lenses can do for your storytelling, then you have to really, really think about how that works. And just understand that, yeah, the answer is what people were telling me. 35 is a 35, idiot. That's basically what they were saying. 50 is a 50. And, I was like, well, if it's micro four thirds and I'm using a 25 millimeter lens and it's a 50 millimeter equivalent, why don't they just call it a 50 millimeter if they're making the lens for micro four thirds? And the answer would always be, because 25 is 25, but no explanation. So now I'm telling you, it is true, but it's because of the way these focal lengths look, how the glass is in the lens, how it's created, and it's all about compression and it's all about distortion. And a 50 will never look like a 25. A 50 will never look like a 35, which is roughly a 50 equivalent on an APS-C. You just never get the same thing. So whether you work APS-C, micro four thirds, or full frame, you have to figure out how you want to work to get exactly what you want. And then you have to figure out if that's realistic for the type of projects that you shoot. You know, are you going to have that kind of space, or do you need that kind of space? Does it matter? That's why full frame is kind of the most flexible. Because even though the lenses are bigger, yes, and it's heavier and blah, 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 it's actually much easier to figure out what you got to do. And you don't have to figure out the amount of space according to the, distance that you have to be from your subject to get the feeling that you're going for. So you shouldn't really think of it as an equivalent and work in that manner, because it's never going to look the same. And you'll never, if you work only APS-C or only micro four thirds, you're never really going to know what a 50 looks like if you're working with a 25 on micro four thirds. Now that's, you might say, who cares, as long as you're used to it and you'll adjust accordingly with your storytelling. And so, you might say something is a 25 and it comes out as 50. You know what I'm saying? Like, at the end of the day, you're going to tell the story with whatever you have, and it's going to look however it's going to look. But if you're somebody who has experience, who knows what a 50 looks like and a 35 looks like and an 85 looks like, it's going to drive you crazy. Like, it's all about nuance, And again, whatever's right for you is cool, I'm not saying that everybody should work in one particular way. Nobody is a monolith, and, it's kind of like saying, all people of one race or one religion or whatever think the same, or they all vote the same or whatever. Nobody is the same, ever, There's nuance to everything in life, and that includes filmmaking and the lens journey, which for me personally is a very spiritual journey. Like, I'm really way into the nuance. I'm way into the way lenses change the way we actually look in real life, or how some lenses can get as close to complete absolute reality as possible. But most lenses can't. And so you have to figure out, especially if you work with anamorphic, then it's a whole other thing, Then the equivalency deal just goes away. And you got to figure out, you have to really experiment to get what you want. So I guess that's the best answer, whether you're working micro four thirds, APS-C, or full frame, experiment with the lenses that are close to what you want. And really, study subjects, get somebody and work on them and, see what it looks like, or work on yourself and see how it feels. See how, the distortion works and the compression, and how far the background is and how much background you have and how far away from the camera you have to go or how close you have to get, and figure out if it's, in line with your working process. If your workflow is in alignment with micro four thirds or APS-C or full frame, go with that, choose like that. Don't just choose because something is lighter or smaller or whatever, unless you don't care. If you don't care, then that's a whole other thing, But I'm talking about for those who care. If you are into the meticulous, if you have like a Mamba mentality when it comes to your filmmaking, and if you want things to look the way you want them to look, and if you want it to be the most convenient for you and how you want to work, and if you want to get things done without having to do math, or if the math doesn't bother you or whatever, just figure it out. Figure out what's best for you. And you'll be in good shape. But this whole thing about, micro four thirds is the equivalent 2 times to a full frame, or, APS-C is 1.5 or 1.6 if it's Canon, equivalency, that's really a lie to people who really care, and to people who, really are specific with their work. That's just a lie. So don't believe it anymore. And at any cost, get what you want. That's the most important part of this. When you start a project and you're a filmmaker, you need to get what you want. And so figure out the best way to do that. And as confusing as this video might be, I hope that helps. I'm using the Panasonic GH5. I'm experimenting using a micro four thirds because I bought one as a backup to my Panasonic S5. And that's it. So please subscribe. Please hit the like button. Sorry if this was confusing. I feel like I confused myself, but it is kind of a confusing thing, and I really don't understand why, why APS-C or micro four thirds lenses even exist, to be honest with you. Because they don't look the same. The equivalency is not true. So why not just make one lens for all cameras and just, use adapters and you're better off, you know? Because if you adapt, like if I adapt my vintage lenses to the Micro Four Thirds, I am going to get the same look that I get on my full frame camera. I just have to work with distance from the subject. So anyway, I said that already. Thanks for watching, and all right, I'll see you later. Peace.